I would like to request the national and international scholars to present their papers. And first of all, we have Dr. Mark Owen. Now, regarding Mark Owen, he belongs to the University of Winchester, United Kingdom, and he is the director of Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace for over 7 years. And he has published many papers on different aspects of Buddhism. And today, he is going to present his paper on Buddhism, conflict and peace building, the challenges and opportunities for Buddhism in Southeast Asia today, right? All right. So now I request Dr. Mark Owen to present his paper in PowerPoint, and as I already said, it should be finished within 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much anyway. So, as I was kindly introduced, I'm from the University of Winchester, and my talk today is going to look at Buddhism, conflict and peace building. And my talks aim to engage with one of the central topics of this conference, which is really Buddhism as a source for peace. And what I'm going to say is something slightly controversial, perhaps, that it's not necessarily inevitable that Buddhism will be a source for peace. And in fact, if we look around Southeast Asia today, there's a number of pressures and challenges that Buddhism faces and people of the Buddhist religion face, which means there's more of a chance, perhaps, at the moment that Buddhism can be co-opted and used for violence than it can be used as an effective source for peace. And I guess that's the simple argument I'm going to make. Obviously, the detail is important, but as our time's been cut, I'm going to try and go quite quickly through it, and hopefully it'll stimulate any questions at the end. So I won't spend much time on this, but just to say, at the university we have Europe's first centre that looks at religion, reconciliation and peace building specifically. We run a number of postgraduate research programs. We're also involved in consultancy, advisory to governments, training, etc. And I'm really just making that point to say very much the research is based in contemporary action-based research that looks at situations on the ground of people living in situations of conflict. My own background's in Buddhism and Southeast Asia, and I've done work here in Nepal, Thailand, currently supporting projects in Myanmar, so very much based in the contemporary realities of people facing conflict. Ooh. Yeah, skip that one. So, just to begin with then, just to offer a brief academic context to the subject of religion, conflict and peace building. So really this subject area that's become more defined since the late 1990s really was a reaction to 9/11. After the terrible atrocities in the US, there was a raft of books really on looking at religion's links to violence and conflict. And as we'll see slightly later, Buddhism didn't escape from this critique, and most religions were linked in some ways, implicitly or explicitly, to conflicts and violence throughout the world. Religious peace building was really a counter-reaction to increasing publications on religion and conflict, and intended to offer a balanced perspective looking at the role religions played both historically and in contemporary society in supporting peace building and reconciliation processes and interventions. And the dominant themes that I'm just going to mention briefly that I'm going to touch on throughout this presentation is really the ambiguous nature of religion. And that simply means if we look back throughout history, we can find examples of all religions being implicated and co-opted in both violence and peace building. The centrality of religious leadership, again something I'll touch on. The thing I'll emphasise most looking at Southeast Asia is the importance of context in religious peace building. So what's going on in the social, political, economic context and how those pressures shape views on religion. And then liberal Western peace building versus just peace, and I'll mention that briefly at the end. So Buddhism, conflict and peace building. So often Buddhism said it's self-evidently a religion of peace, but actually there's been a wide-ranging critique which has tried to argue that actually Buddhism's been involved in conflict, violent oppression as much as any other religion. So just to give a few examples, even Neumayer has looked at both Sri Lanka and Tibet and argued that a range of Buddhist ideas, such as the idea of the arhat, tendency of karma to internalize social ills, and mytho-historical narratives. So we've got texts like the Mahavamsa in Sri Lanka, and this link with ethno-nationalism, Buddhist militancy, has meant that religion, Buddhism's often been implicated, as I said, in violence and structural oppression and violence. So there's a quote from one of the foremost Buddhist peace builders in Southeast Asia today, Suluk Sivaraksa. Buddhism, as practiced in most Asian countries today, serves to mainly legitimize dictatorial regimes and multinational companies. So pretty unequivocal in his view of how religion plays out in most contemporary Southeast Asian societies. Also, Catherine Morris has talked similarly about Cambodia and how it's been implicated and used there for structural oppression. So again, just some further examples. So things like doctrine of impermanence, if it's interpreted with a degree of fatalism, undermines desires to address social and structural problems. And this has been one of the biggest critiques of Buddhism, particularly that it's seen as a religion of inner peace and therefore doesn't address social inequalities and ills. Another couple of examples which I won't go through mainly because of time. So the most comprehensive study's probably been done by Jerison and Juergenmeyer, and essentially their conclusion was that Buddhism's been complicit in many wars and instances of violent oppression in Asia, again fairly unequivocal. So violent conflict is likely to occur in Buddhist countries as much as anywhere else, and we can see that in Tibet with the armed insurgency and resistance supported by the CIA against the Chinese invasion. Sri Lankan monks involved in violent protests, also implicated in some ways in the conflict there. Contemporary Buddhist attacks in Myanmar have been going on for a number of years on minority religious groups, including Muslims, Buddhist-Muslim conflicts in southern Thailand. So we can look around Southeast Asia and we can find plenty of examples where Buddhists are involved and implicated in violent and structural oppression. So, as I said, my main argument really today is if we look at the contemporary Southeast Asian context, there's a lot of challenges to Buddhism, which is actually continuing to push it in the direction of being linked with things like Buddhist nationalism, the rise of right-wing religious nationalism, Buddhist militancy, etc. So things like narratives of extreme Islamic extremism and militancy, this is causing a counter-reaction, which we can see in places like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, to some extent Thailand, Indonesia, other countries, where the reaction is a rise of Buddhist nationalism and associated Buddhist extremism. The domination of globalized secular narratives, again, this is a challenge to Buddhism, a challenge to religion all over the world. And again, the well-recorded reaction of most religions is to feel victimized, become more insular, and in fact, this perpetuates a breeding ground for religious extremism. Tensions within Buddhist communities, and again, we can see that in countries where Buddhism's been implicated in violence. And one of the biggest challenges that I'm going to come back to is its relevance to contemporary social, economic, political discourses, challenges and developments. And what I'm saying here is if Buddhism doesn't remain and retain its relevance to tackling some of the social, economic inequalities and problems within Southeast Asia, then there's a good chance that people will continue to, as the data shows, move away from religion and look for other solutions to these problems. So I'm going to go on to a bit more positive note now for a couple of minutes. So opportunities for Buddhism as a force for peace. So if we look at Buddhism, in essence, it is one of the only religions that we can say is a peaceful religion in terms of scripture and doctrine. And there's a huge numbers of examples we can draw on, and here's just a few. Things like the 5 precepts, practice of mindfulness in controlling our own emotions, our own reactions, and compassion and equanimity towards others. The Brahma Viharas, the ideal of the Bodhisattva, the ultimate being of compassion and kindness, and things like dependent origination, used a lot like peace builders, by peace builders such as Thich Nhat Hanh, who've talked about how everybody is dependent and integrated and networked throughout the world, and therefore violence to others is violence to ourselves, etc. And using this as a sound basis for development of Buddhist peace philosophy. There's also an increasing number of engaged Buddhist peace-building organizations throughout the world, and we see this movement in the last 20, 30 years. It's been a huge rise in the number of action-orientated engaged Buddhist movements, which is again a shift away from that critique that Buddhism is not engaged in social problems and ills. We also have plenty of Buddhist peace builders to look up to in this area, and there's a picture of a few I'm sure you know. However, just as a word of warning then, to end on, the Buddhist context may look conducive to peace building at first, but it can easily generate a high degree of frustration. And this goes back to the point that I'm saying, in essence, we talk about Buddhism being a religion for peace, but actually in practice, Buddhism is often implicated in that violent and structural oppression. So reflecting on the possibilities of religious peace building, we have to beware of naivety. Religious peace building is not self-evident, transparent, or linear, or strictly manageable phenomenon. So that means we just can't expect religions to be forces for peace, and that includes Buddhism. We have to be proactive in making sure that they are forces for peace and not tend towards that ambiguity that they're also co-opted and used for violence and oppression. So how do we overcome that ambiguity and make sure religions are force for peace in Southeast Asia for today? Obviously a highly complex problem, but here's a couple of things I'm going to suggest to end on. So coming back to the responsibility of leaders, a huge responsibility on religious leaders to talk and preach about peace. And that's something we're not necessarily seeing by all Buddhist leaders in Southeast Asia today. And again, we can go around different countries and give examples. And training and education on religion, Buddhism and peace building. I mean, it's often assumed that even senior religious leaders are natural peace builders, and that's not necessarily the case. Of course, we can see a few examples of charismatic, exceptional Buddhist leaders that have brought peace to their communities and societies, but peace building, like anything else, is a skill and becoming increasingly a profession. And we need to enhance the training and capacity building of not only Buddhist leaders, but Buddhist communities across Southeast Asia to support peace building. And one of the suggestions is, as the fountain of world peace, have we heard, where better than a Buddhist training and peace centre in Lumbini? And this is something that's been mentioned by Venerable Matea as an interest of his as Vice Chairman of the Lumbini Development Trust. And this might perhaps contain or offer teachings on greater understandings of religion in the role of conflict and peace building, something that's needed hugely, particularly, as I said, in Southeast Asia today. Religious peace building, project planning and the design. Again, peace building, like development was 20, 30 years ago, is relatively haphazard these days and done by people who have got no formal training. And we need to formalise that training and make sure people who are involved in peace building have the skills and professionalism to make sure these projects and processes have effective outcomes. Engaging with broader and social, political, economic context, something I've mentioned before that Buddhism and Buddhist peace builders need to do in order to remain relevant in contemporary society. And lastly, liberal Western rights-based peace building versus cultural specificity. I'm not going to go into this, but this is the challenge where things like human rights, peace-building ideals come into conflict with cultural ideals and norms and what we do about that. And these are all areas that need much greater research and training, and perhaps something we can establish here in Lumbini in the future. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Owen, for completing your presentation in time. because I don't have to click the buzzer. Thank you very much.